Think, think, think.
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
CO2 is warming the planet. And the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase. And that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects. The effects on the weather, perhaps worse, the indirect effects in that the natural ecosystems can't adjust to these rapid changes, and so you get ecosystem collapses. Now, the exact amount of how you map from a certain increase in of CO2 to what temperature will be and where the positive feedbacks are, there's some uncertainty there, but not very much. And there's certainly uncertainty about how bad those effects will be, but they will be extremely bad. I asked the top scientists on this several times, do we really have to get down to near zero? Can't we just, cut it in half or a quarter? And the answer is that until we get near to zero, the temperature will continue to rise. And so that's a big challenge. It's very different than saying, we're a 12-foot high truck trying to get under a 10-foot bridge and we can just sort of squeeze under. This is something that has to get to zero.
When people say, well, you don't believe in global warming, I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
A few years ago, if you would ask me, I would tell you it's CO2. Why? Because just like everyone else in the public, I listened to what the media had to say.
Each day, the news reports grow more fantastically apocalyptic. Politicians no longer dare to express any doubt about climate change.
There is such intolerance of any dissenting voice.
Are some of the worst climate criminals on the planet.
This is the most politically incorrect thing possible, is to doubt this climate change orthodoxy.
Global warming has gone beyond politics. It is a new kind of morality.
Now, the Prime Minister's back from his holidays, unrepentant and unembarrassed about yet another long-haul destination.
Yet, as the frenzy over man-made global warming grows shriller, many senior climate scientists say the actual scientific basis for the theory is crumbling.
There were periods, for example, in Earth's history when we had 3 times as much CO2 as we have today, or periods when we had 10 times as much CO2 as we have today. And if CO2 has a large effect on climate, then you should see it in the temperature reconstruction.
If we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller. The atmosphere is made up of a multitude of gases. A small percentage of them we call greenhouse gases, and of that very small percentage of greenhouse gases, 95% of it is water vapor. It's the most important greenhouse gas.
Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, by far the most important greenhouse gas.
CO2 began to increase exponentially in about 1940, but the temperature actually began to decrease 1940 continued till about 1975. So this is the opposite relation. When the CO2 is increasing rapidly, but yet the temperature is decreasing, then we cannot say that CO2 and the temperature go together.
Temperature went up significantly up to 1940 when human production of CO2 was relatively low. And then in the post-war years, when industry and the whole economies of the world really got going, and human production of CO2 just soared, the global temperature was going down. In other words, the facts didn't fit the theory.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for 4 decades until the 1970s, and then rose again after that.
One of the problems that is plaguing the models is that they predict that as you go up through the atmosphere, except in the polar regions, that the rate of warming increases. And it's quite clear from 2 data sets, not just satellite data, which everybody talks about, but from weather balloon data, that you don't see that effect. In fact, it looks like the surface temperatures are warming slightly more than the upper air temperatures. That's a big difference.
That data gives you a handle on the fact that what you're seeing is warming that probably is not due to greenhouse gases.
That is, the observations do not show an increase with altitude. In fact, most observations show a slight decrease in the rate of warming with altitude. So in a sense, you can say that the hypothesis of man-made global warming is falsified by the evidence.
Inevitably, the moment politicians put their weight behind something and attach their name to it in some ways, of course, money will flow. That's the way it goes. And inevitably research, development, institutions started to bubble up, if we can put it that way, which were going to be researching climate, but with a particular emphasis on the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature.
At the request of Mrs. Thatcher, the UK Met Office set up a climate modelling unit which provided the basis for a new international committee called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
They came out with the first big report which predicted climatic disaster as a result of global warming. I remember going to the scientific press conference and being amazed by 2 things. First, the simplicity and eloquence of the message and the vigour with which it was delivered. And secondly, the total disregard of all climate science up till that time, including, incidentally, the role of the sun, which had been the subject of a major meeting at the Royal Society just a few months earlier.
Think.
Hey, what's wrong, Sonny? Got yourself a headache?
No, I was just thinking.